welcome to the Farmhouse. I'm Stephanie Spiker.
I'm Candace Worsbowski.
And today we are going to be joined by Katie Dotterer. But before we get into all the very cool things that Katie is doing in the ag industry, Candace has a little treat for you.
Yeah, hi everyone. So we currently have a column online from Shelby Watson-Hampton, who you may remember as a previous Farmhouse guest. And this column is titled 10 Women You Meet in Farm Country. Which one are you? And it sounds like a quiz, and although that would be very entertaining, it's actually a listicle. And in it, Shelby dives into all sorts of farm women, from independent first-generation farmers to different types of farm moms to women who are juggling off-farm jobs with on-farm responsibilities, which might sound familiar to some of you out there. I just wanted to bring it up here under Little Treats because it's a fun read, and I think it does a really good job encapsulating all of the different ways women approach farm life. And I'm sure a lot of women wouldn't necessarily see themselves as just one of the entries on this list, because you might be a 4-H show mom, but you might also be juggling an off-farm job, because if we have learned anything on this podcast, it is that women always have multiple balls in the air. Or you might have moved through several of these categories as your life has progressed. Maybe you started out as a newlywed farm wife where farming was new to you and you kind of married into the lifestyle. And now you're a farm grandma with, years of farming under your belt. So however you identify as a woman on the farm, I think this story is a fun read. It's a worthwhile read, and I think it'll bring a smile to your face, so I recommend it. And again, it's called 10 Women You Meet in Farm Country. Which one are you? And it is on lancasterfarming.com right now.
So now we're going to meet another woman in farm country. Again, her name is Katie Dotterer. She grew up on a dairy farm, and then she actually also ran her own dairy farm for a number of years. But right now she's doing something in ag that's pretty unique and also very cool, I think, at least.
Very admirable.
Yeah. So Katie runs a business called AgvoKate. So that is spelled AgvoKate. And one of the main things she does through AgvoKate is she teaches Spanish to farmers and people in the ag industry so that they're able to communicate with their Spanish-speaking workers. And then she also teaches English as a second language to Spanish-speaking farm workers. So Katie is doing a lot of really cool work to kind of bridge the communication gap between American farmers and farm workers, and then their Spanish-speaking employees who are doing a lot of the work on the farm. So
yeah, and she's got a really great handle on the situation and some really interesting and informed takes on what is going on here. So I can't wait to hear more.
Katie, welcome to the Farmhouse. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
So did you always want to work in agriculture?
I did. Well, I really didn't have a choice. I was born into it. But yeah, I have kind of a unique journey of how I got to where I currently am. So it started with agriculture, and it is still agriculture all these years later.
All right. So I know you, as you said, you were born into it. You grew up on a third-generation dairy farm, and then you worked on a first-generation dairy farm. So to clarify for us and for our listeners, are you still actively farming?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
But you are correct. Third generation. And my family farm is still in operation to this day in central Pennsylvania. So I left in 2009 and I co-owned my own dairy for about 13 years.
Okay. So what was it like kind of going from your family farm to then starting out on your own dairy farm? I mean, I think, it's common for, the younger generation to take over the family farm, but I feel like it's maybe a little less common of a path to go from that background and then decide like, you know what, I'm going to just start my own.
It actually wasn't my idea, to be honest. It was my now ex-husband's. And if you would ask me in high school, Katie, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? And I wanted to be part of the third generation at the family farm. I wanted to, I grew up on the field operation part of it. So, but I did do a lot of milkings. And so I was very well versed of the whole operation. And I was all for, though, leaving and starting our own because I like challenges. I like adventure. So it's quite an adventure. I will tell you that. I used to get asked all the time, like advice for farmers that want to do kind of the similar thing, because we're told a lot that, oh, it's impossible. And actually, my dad used to tell me this, oh, it's impossible to start your own farm if you don't, have a family farm, which obviously that's not true.
Hmm.
So first generation farming is a completely different ballgame, right? So you don't have the equity that multi-generational farms have. You don't have the money. You don't have really the support. I mean, I think we went a whole year without any employees. So you're really technically starting from ground zero. And
Hmm.
it's a hard life. I mean, anybody in dairy knows dairy farming in general it's a lifestyle, right? But it's very demanding in all aspects. And that's all I knew. And so when I left the dairy farming part of what I did in 2021, I was scared. I had no idea what I was going to do. I was teaching at that time in the public school system, Spanish and business management. And I was like, okay, well, I guess I'll do this. And then I was making all these really big decisions, and I just decided to turn what was a side hustle into a full-time career, which is how I am still involved in agriculture to this day.
Great. So can you tell us what you are doing now?
Yes, so I run the business called AgvoKate. I'm going to spell it because a lot of people get it messed up. It's AgvoKate. So a play on my name, right?
Hmm.
And advocating for agriculture. And I used to advocate for agriculture on a different level. So I had these amazing opportunities on like Good Morning America, Fox News segments, virtual farm tours, you name it. I was out there talking
Wow.
to
Yeah.
consumers. Yeah. And I still love to do it. And I work on contract with some companies to still do that, but I'm advocating now in a different way and for a different purpose or passion, if you will. So my entire in business, it's multifaceted. People, I feel like, have a hard time wrapping their heads around it. So there is an advocating part of it, but the
Hmm.
biggest part is I teach Spanish online for the ag industry. And when I say I teach, and people automatically want to think that I'm teaching in a school or that I'm teaching little kids, not at all. All of my students are adults. They are from California to Delaware to Canada.
Hmm.
They are farmers, they are veterinarians, they are pharmaceutical reps, hoof trimmers, milk testers, you name it, I've probably had them. Last I looked at my rosters, I have taught over 600 some people in the industry, and it
Wow.
keeps growing. So I teach online Spanish for agriculture, and then I also teach English as a second language. There's a whole program I'm trying to create by myself, but I do teach that in person right now. And that's at a farm. Again, my students are adults. So that's like the biggest part. I also do public speaking, and I would like to grow that more at some point. It's just trying to manage all of the different balls that I have, juggling all the time.
Right.
So the reason I did this, though, is the Spanish part started as a side hustle. So ever since I was a senior in high school when my family hired our first Spanish speaker. His name was Octavio. He was from Mexico. I will always remember him. And I've always loved Spanish. I actually started learning in the third grade. It's a story, but I was really looking forward to taking Spanish in high school. And I took the 2 years and I hated it because
Okay.
my teacher was a great person, but not a good teacher. I lost my love for it. And I was like, well, this just seems
Mm.
more like work. By the way, I don't do many things that aren't fun. So I was like, peace out. Don't want to do that anymore. But it wasn't until we hired Octavio that he reignited my passion for the language and the culture, because I was milking third shift with him, so the night shift, and he would
Hmm.
just teach me so much. So that was what reignited my passion for it. And long story short, throughout my entire career as a dairy farmer, we always talk about uh, the gap between farmers and the non-farming consumers, right? So like we're less than 2% of the population. But I was like, is nobody else seeing this gap that we have within the agriculture, which is the cultural gap and the
Yeah.
language gap? Like, is nobody seeing this but me? So, and as my farm grew, so did my team. So I have always worked with Spanish speakers from various countries in Latin America. And it broke my heart when I was experiencing firsthand, like, and I do a presentation on this. It's called Reaching Across the Cultural Border. Just And I know some people don't realize what they're saying is discriminatory, but I'm like, y'all need to rein it in, or you need to at least be
Yeah.
cognizant of what you're saying, what your actions are portraying, and how they're making other people feel, especially the people that you're hiring to, in production agriculture. Here's a stat that might blow your mind. 70% of the workers in agriculture as a whole, not just dairy, but as a whole in the US, 70% speak Spanish.
Wow. Okay.
Wow. And I used to say that the US agriculture industry would be crippled without a immigrant labor force. I no longer say that. I say that we would actually be non-existent. And if people want to argue with me, which they can. I will die on this hill. And until things are super automated and we don't need the workers that we need for the work that we need, I have been on the HR part. I have interviewed tons of Americans for milking cows. Nobody wants to do the job. Nobody wants to go out and work the long hours out in the fields, picking things by, picking vegetables, produce, whatever by hand. But they're willing to do it. And so I was witnessing this gap. I was witnessing the discrimination just between like wage disparities.
Yeah.
Just because somebody spoke a different language, they were there the same amount of time as their American cohort. They had the same amount of experience, but yet you're paying them less because they speak a different language or they look different than you. That didn't sit well with me. So I was like, okay, how can I help this? Like, what can I do to help bridge this gap? So it's Spanish and it's English as a second language. And my whole mission of what I do is meet in the middle. I'm not asking either side to be fluent in Spanish or English, but there's nothing wrong with learning how to say good morning. How's your family?
Right.
Hey, the cow is sick. Can you grab the red bucket? And I really wish, especially people would give Spanish a chance because it's such a fun language and I absolutely love teaching it. So I don't know if I left anything out there, but can you tell I'm a little passionate about it?
No, we can tell. And it's a great thing to be passionate about, I think, because you made so many good points there and things that people need to be aware of. So it was good to get it out there. So you kind of already touched on this, but maybe we can expand more on it. There's, I'm sure, plenty of people out there who would argue that it's the Spanish-speaking workers' job to learn English because they're the ones who have come to America, which is a predominantly English-speaking country. Instead of arguing, on the other hand, that, well, maybe it's also the English-speaking farm owners or managers' job to learn some Spanish. So what would you say to those people who might try to make that argument?
I get this every single time I promote my Spanish classes. And it used to make me really angry, but I just have to take a step back and I realize their frustration. So to answer that, my first response is, how's that working out for you? How is complaining about that working for you, especially if you're an employer employing Spanish speakers? In my opinion, I think it is a responsibility of employers if you are hiring Spanish speakers. Again, I'm not asking you to be fluent, but you could meet them halfway. And here's what people don't realize. When you take that step as an employer or even as a coworker, you don't have to own the business, but take that little step and learn phrases, learn some lingo, right? You have no idea what that does to a Spanish speaker. Like the best feedback that I get from my students are, Katie, oh my gosh, all I said was buenos dias and you should have seen their face light up. I'm like, I know, right? How cool is this? And then it actually motivates them to want to learn English. Actually, most of them do want to learn English. And unfortunately, we just don't have a very good, we haven't provided a good way to do that. So that's another thing that I'm working on. But it's not just incentivizing them to learn English. It's called respect, right? Like if you are going to, again, hire Spanish speakers, learn how to say some words, learn how to say some phrases. And it's so fun because when I used to do this, even before I started AgvoKate, it was, you know what? Hey, I want to learn how to say bucket or whatever. So I knew how to say, ¿cómo se dice? How do you say? And it was just a fun little conversation in the parlor that I would have with my employees. And we'd have this fun little like side conversation about language. And so I could teach them, okay, we call this a bucket in English, all while dry treating cows. Like
Yeah.
it's not hard. And it's you're treating your employees more like your family, really, than just employees, right? I was actually just at a farm yesterday. I do some translation. It's not my favorite thing to do. I don't put it on my list of services, but I was really disheartened to hear from the farmer. So I was telling them about my Spanish classes because I was obviously none of their staff could speak English, but the farmer themselves could not speak Spanish. And I said, I have a program that could help with that. They're like, oh, well, I'm not learning Spanish. They had not a very good attitude about it. And then I said about English. And they're like, well, we don't want them to learn a lot of English because they'll leave. And I was like, then how do you think? Right? I know. And I said, I was really dumbfounded because I said, then how do you expect to solve or even bring a solution to the table of your communication barrier? Because I was there to help translate, like, how can we be more efficient with the current, work responsibilities that the employees have? And when you boil it all down, it is communication. So what are you willing to do to help that? You can't just sit there and complain about it if you don't have a solution.
Right. Yeah. And it is interesting because I think that in most jobs, if you ask people what is one of the most important tools to have to be successful, they would say communication.
Yes.
So it's funny that this seems to be kind of, dismissed or falling by the wayside or however you want to say it, out on these farms.
Yeah.
When literally any other job, you would know that this is critical.
It's common sense, is it not?
Well, that's, I feel like it's a no-brainer. I mean, if you refuse to take the steps to be able to communicate with your workers, well, what if they're not doing something in the most efficient manner or something like that? At the end of the day, then that's money down the drain because you can't tell them what you need them to be doing. I don't know. That just seems like you're going against your own, what's the word I'm looking for? Going against your own benefits at that point, I guess.
I agree. And we talked about, productivity and safety. Safety is a big thing that I think people just glaze over. So like the farmer was getting upset that this one employee wasn't doing something, consistently. And I said, well, did you communicate that? Well, I tried Google Translate, which can I just tell you, I hate Google Translate. Absolutely hate it. It's fine in a pinch, right? Like it's a tool, it's a helpful tool. There's a better app, by the way, but you have to remember that any translation tool that you're using, it's AI. It's not taking into consideration cultural nuances. Here's an example. I had one of my students, I always get them to share their Google fails with me because I'm like, see, this is why learning in an actual like training format would be much more beneficial. He had said, he put in Google Translate, we are giving shots this Friday, right? So like a vaccine or whatever. Well, Google Translate spits out tiros, which are gunshots. So
oh God,
the Spanish speaker was
a little different.
Like, we're doing what this, So
like maybe we should call the cops here. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm showing up to work this Friday. Jeez.
What people don't understand though is while we say shots, there is we don't use that word like that in Spanish. Shots in Spanish are either going to be the drink or a gunshot. What we use in Spanish is the word for injection.
Okay.
So it should have said we are giving inyecciones, injections, so it's little things like that. And here's my other problem with Google Translate. And I experienced this at the farm yesterday. They kept whipping their phones out. And I was like, other than it being AI and not being a great tool to use consistently, do you know what message that you're sending to your employees? Here, I don't care about you enough to learn some of your phrases. So I'm just going to keep bringing my phone out every single time I communicate with you. And they're going to do the same thing. They're going to mimic you. So if you want them to want to learn English, if you want to have a better relationship with them, step up and do the work.
Right.
Yeah. So, you mentioned that it's 70% of the agricultural workforce that speaks Spanish. And I feel like maybe this is more so in this region in the Mid-Atlantic, but I think there's this kind of misconception that most Spanish-speaking farm workers are out in California, right? Like, oh, of course, like, yeah, they're in California, they're doing the produce out there. But obviously that's not the case. Obviously, they are all over the country. So why do you feel like it is maybe less understood in this region that there are Spanish-speaking farm workers that, are here and need support?
I don't know that. I think a lot of people understand that there are, because you go anywhere. I mean, a grocery store, really anywhere. There's Spanish speakers everywhere. I just think that people have this unfortunately, I'm going to call it an antiquated mindset, especially in agriculture. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of progressive thinkers out there. What gets me though is like, we are so progressive in agriculture when it comes to technology, right? And how to
Oh, yeah.
be more productive, and how to, have these benchmarks with all these other things. But when it comes to us thinking about, again, culture and how to connect with others, why are we still stuck in the 50s of, well, we've always done it this way with, our American employees. So we're gonna, you can't do the same thing. It's
Right.
2024, like things have to change. The way we've milked cows has changed. Why can't we also change the way we think about how we interact and communicate with others? That to me is huge, because if you don't have that piece first, nothing else is gonna matter. Right. So
Yeah.
again, it's just so fresh in my head with being at this farm yesterday. Um, it's like, your productivity is not going to go up. Your efficiencies are not going to be solved until the communication part is solved. If you're not going to take a Spanish course, then put resources and money into the English course. One of my biggest concerns with my ESL program is that employers are not going to want to help pay for that for their employers. When in any other business or industry, it's called professional development, right? So you got to give and take here on one side or the other. And again, in my opinion, it should be on both ends. But anyway, one of my suggestions was, hey, why don't we get a whiteboard and put some of the most commonly used terms that you go over, which, by the way, my entire class, we do this. So you can point to a word in English, but then there's also the Spanish word. So you are learning the Spanish word and they are learning the English word. It's just
Meeting in the middle.
Yes, it's taking that extra step. It's really, I think maybe people think that it's just like this big undertaking, and it's really not. It really, really isn't. So anyway, that's where my classes come in, because my first, so I do dairy. I've expanded into the swine and poultry sectors in the last couple of years, which has been really fun for me because I'm learning all about other sectors. I know dairy like the back of my hand. But so like the very first vocab list, I'm just going to give you an example in dairy. You're learning how to say cow, heifer, bucket, gate. So I've actually had people from other industries take it because it has so many general ag terms too that you can use. Of course, yeah, I have a specific milking parlor terminology. Or here's a fun fact. In swine, I learned that there are 6 different ways to say piglet, depending on where somebody is from.
Oh my gosh.
Right? So I know, so that's the reaction that I get a lot. Like, oh my gosh, Katie, there's 6 ways. How do I know which way? And I'm like, this is the fun part. You ask your employees that are working for you, hey, which one of these do you use? One, they're going to be just ecstatic that you have a list with all 6 of them on there. And then the cool part again is you're asking them, what term do you prefer that I use? What term would you like? What term is more common in your country? And maybe it's a completely different term, but they're just going to be excited and respect the fact that you care enough to ask that.
Nice. So aside from the language, have there been any cultural differences that come with Spanish-speaking workers that you've had to help American farmers or farm workers navigate?
Oh, yes. Oh, Cinco de Mayo is one of them. And I post about it every year. And it's so funny because a lot of people look forward to my post. I wasn't going to do it this last year. And they're like, where's your Cinco de Mayo post? I'm like, oh, okay. So most people, do you guys know what Cinco de Mayo celebrates?
I don't actually.
I
don't celebrate Cinco de Mayo really.
I feel like I've probably at some point in my life learned the background of it, but I don't know.
So Americans think that it celebrates the Independence Day for Mexico because May 4th, maybe it's like our July 4th.
Yeah.
Sorry, May 5th. Like our July 4th. Absolutely not. Their Independence Day is actually in September. Okay. So I do this post every year because I'm like, this is super important to educate, because some farms, and I think this comes from a good place, they would bring in taco trucks on Cinco de Mayo. And here's the Cinco de Mayo is only celebrated in one little town in Mexico. It is not even celebrated in the entire country. One little town called Puebla in the state of Puebla in Mexico. That's it. Nobody else celebrates it because it commemorates the Battle of Puebla, which I won't go. I'm a history nerd and I could like do a whole segment on this, but it has to do with the Civil War. So it is attached, if you will, to what was going on in the US at the time, but it had nothing to do with Americans. It has nothing to do with an Independence Day. So we really need to be careful and cognizant because I had a couple of Hispanics when I first started posting about it. And actually one in particular, he was from Puebla. He sent me a DM on Instagram and said, "Hey, Katie, thank you so much for sharing this. I never understood why Americans celebrated our holiday." And I said, well, fun fact, it sells a lot of beer. That's why.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Beer and margaritas.
Margaritas.
And to each their own, because some people think that I'm telling them not to celebrate it. You do what you want, man. Like, to each their own. But understand why you're celebrating. Understand the history behind it and the significance. Because and people are like, oh, well, Spanish speakers don't care. I'm like, oh, did you ask them that? Did you ask them if they don't care that you're celebrating Cinco de Mayo the way you're celebrating it, like with all the beer and you have no clue why you're taking shots or margaritas or whatever? Did you ask them that? And maybe they have. And my response to this one person that was really coming at me for it, I said, maybe the majority of Hispanics here in this country don't care, but there's probably a handful that do. To me, you just need to be mindful. So that's probably the biggest one. Another one is Dia de los Muertos, which is Day of the Dead. People want to say, oh, that's Mexican Halloween. You say that to a Hispanic? No, it's much, much more involved in that. I won't go into it, but if you want to get a really good education about that beautiful holiday, watch the Disney Pixar Coco.
I love Coco.
Yeah.
So I am familiar with Dia de los Muertos, and that is a holiday that I love, and I do wish that we would celebrate it, or, if we need to create our own version of it here in our country, because I do think that it is a sentiment that deserves recognition and deserves celebrating. So I also encourage people, watch Coco. It's a great movie, but also, look it up because it's a really touching holiday.
It is. And I think if more people would, and I always go over it in my classes. So I go over cultural stuff as well as language. And I had this one student, she lost her mother halfway through my class. And of course we worked through that, but she came back at the end and she said, I just want to let you know that when you taught about Day of the Dead, I looked into it more and it actually helped me grieve the loss of my mom a lot more because that's the entire, point and message of Day of the Dead. It's not Halloween.
Yeah.
So it's it's really respecting. Holidays are just a part of a culture, right? It's respecting the holidays. It's respecting their food. It's respecting, again, this came up yesterday about how they live together, multiple family members, all together in one house, or there's so many things. And I'm not asking people to like learn all about it. And there's one part that I go in my presentation of there's a difference between ignorance and arrogance, right? You can fix ignorance. You can learn about things so you're not ignorant about a certain topic. But when you're arrogant and you think that your culture reigns supreme or your language reigns supreme, that's where that's not okay, and that's going to get you into some trouble.
Hard agree.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you mentioned that the people who are taking these Spanish courses, they're adults, and all the jobs you've mentioned, it's like farmers, nutritionists, and all these different things. These people are working full time. So how do you structure your program so that your students can get the most out of learning the language, but also not have it be too much of like an added burden?
That's a great question because I get that a lot from prospective students that are like, how am I going to juggle this? I'm like, listen, I got you. I designed this. I went back to school. So I got my Spanish degree while I was a first generation farmer. So I was milking cows, doing payroll in between taking classes. So I get it. I structure this class. There are live classes, but every single one of them are recorded. So actually the majority of my students take my classes through recordings. And they're posted within a couple hours after a class is over. The class itself is only an hour long. There's a lot that I put in there, but you can rewatch it as long as you want or as many times as you want. So the recordings are there. I do assign homework. Now, let me explain the homework. It's nothing like super long or drawn out. It's usually like 2 pages, not even. And what it is, it's reinforcement, right? There's a reason why teachers give homework. It's to reinforce the material that we put together. We also always go over this homework. And we are putting simple sentences together by week 3, which I get really excited. I have taught this class for like, I don't know, 6 years, and I still get super excited for my students because I can see their progress. And they're small sentences like, the cow is sick, la vaca está enferma. And I was like, look at you, you just put a sentence together. How fun. So it's when students give it a shot, they're more apt to manage their time a little better to be able to take this class. So, and I only assign homework on the Thursday. So classes are Tuesday and Thursday evenings. That's another way I try to accommodate adults. It's in the evenings. If you can block off an hour, cool. If you can't, again, I had a student that was like, I watch both of your classes on a Friday. Like that's when I have time, which is fine. The class itself, there's 8 weeks of live but recorded classes, and then you actually get an additional 6 weeks to go back, maybe pace yourself, rewatch the videos, go back through the vocab, and you have access to me for the entire 14 weeks and be like, hey, Katie, I'm not really understanding this. Like my students during sessions, my students are my number one priority. I will make time for you. I had a couple students that will send me a laundry list of like, I don't understand these grammar concepts. Hey, let's schedule a 101 Zoom call. And I have this fun little smart board here behind me that makes learning a lot of fun. So I try to accommodate my students as best I can. I understand their schedule, right? Like I used to be a farmer and I used to take classes in between it. So I'm very accommodating. I try to be, and very forgiving. So.
Yeah. Yeah, you like as you mentioned, you in high school stopped taking Spanish because you didn't feel like you were having fun with it anymore. So I feel like especially as an adult, it's so tough to learn a new language.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that you do to keep learning the language fun for them?
So I will tell you that learning a language as an adult is actually pretty easy. Spanish is one of the easiest languages to learn because, fun fact, it is the most phonetic language in the world, which means you actually pronounce it the way you see it, unlike English. So I have a lot of students that were like, I love I have these silly little ways to remember things. So for example, any word that ends in sion, C-I-O-N in Spanish, we have because it doesn't end in so there's gender in Spanish. I don't want to go into in the weeds here, but it's either masculine or feminine. And people are like, well, it doesn't end in O or A. So how do I know? Here's how you remember that. It sounds to me French, sillon. So therefore it's fancy. Therefore it is feminine. So it's always going to be like la canción, the song. The other cool part about Spanish is there's so many cognates. So I'm going to try this out on you guys. If I told you the word tanque, what does that sound like in English?
A tank.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's it. It is tank. So if I just add el tanque de leche, I just said milk tank.
Right.
If I say el tanque de agua, water tank. Here's another one. This was super easy. Importante.
Important.
Oh, important.
Important. There are so many of those. And I've started incorporating this fun cognate activity when I present on this topic. So I'm hoping that it gives people more confidence of, oh my gosh, yeah, I can do this, because there are a lot of words that sound similar. And then when we get into like the weeds of like conjugation, I have songs, I dance, like I don't want to say I make a fool of myself, but I have fun with it. I teach the way I wish somebody would have taught me.
Yeah.
Yeah. It does make a big difference.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I feel like, I would think as a student who's taking the time out of my life, like I have a job, I have all these other responsibilities, and I'm taking the time to do this course, like I would want a teacher who's having fun and being silly with it. Because if you're just sitting there like staring at a textbook or something, who's going to do that?
Yeah. The cool thing too about the live classes, because I do still have students that join live. The awesome part is those that have to take the classes via recordings, the feedback that I've gotten, because I was a little concerned when I first started this, and they're like, this is awesome because I'm still engaged, because I'm still feel like I'm part of the student interaction because you recorded the student interaction, so it's still, so no matter if you are attending live or watching it as a recording, you're still engaged, you're still having fun. And an hour goes so quick. There's so many times we get to the end and my students are like, can we do 30 more minutes? And I'm like, no, because I have another class to teach.
Great. So, according to your website, you are committed to fostering an agricultural community of culturally conscious and respectful people through ongoing education and dialogue. And so, what are some ways that you're able to do that outside of the virtual classroom setting?
Any networking event that I go to, really any event that I go to, whether it's in ag or actually outside of agriculture, this is a topic that keeps getting brought up because it is a concern, right? It's the labor shortages and the labor concerns that we have in agriculture are never going to go away. So
Yes.
that's where I come in, and I like to have these conversations. Like the questions you guys have asked me so far are a lot of the questions that I get, especially with, well, they're here, they need to learn English. And
Mm-hmm.
so I actually take that as an opportunity now to say, okay, well, what are you doing to help with that? Or,
Mm-hmm.
are you learning some Spanish? Are you willing to put up the resources to help them learn English? So it's really having those conversations with a lot of people, and not that I'm out to change everybody's mindset, but there's this quote that I really love, and it says, start normalizing changing your opinion when presented with new information,
Mm.
right? We need to remember that even though we're adults, we are still learning. We are always learning. And in my opinion, if you're not learning, you're not living. Um, so that's how I do that. Like I have really great conversations, really in English and in Spanish. I tell my ESL students, so I teach 7 Spanish speakers. They're all from different parts of Mexico right now. They work on a swine operation. And I teach them for 90 minutes in person every Wednesday. And we have these fantastic conversations about working here in the US, what they need. And I can take those experiences and those stories, and I either relay them into my classes or in the conversations I have with people to really make kind of an impact, if you will. So, for example, when people want to come at me with the whole, they're here, they need to learn English. I'm like, well, fun story, they actually do. But here's also why English is actually really hard to learn. I walked into one of my ESL classes once, and I am always prepared with something, but I always ask, is there something specific you want to learn?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember Omar looking at me and he said, well, so we went to Target yesterday, and he's obviously telling me this in Spanish. I was like, oh, cool, how'd you like it? And he goes, well, we went in to buy clothes. I said, did you buy any clothes? And he's like, no, we didn't buy any. I said, oh, why not? And he just kind of looked down at the ground and he said, because we didn't know how to say, can we try these on?
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's,
Such a simple thing
yeah.
that, like,
Mm-hmm. You take for granted.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
So when I tell people that story, I can almost see them take a step back and they're like, wow. I'm like, yeah, they're trying. And we
Mm-hmm.
take for granted a lot of little things like that. And so that whole class, I had something completely different to teach, but we went over different items of clothing, and we went over, like, we did role play. So I was like the dressing room attendant, and they had to,
Mm-hmm.
say how many and things like that. So it's little things. And then I like to give people examples of how hard the English language is. Because I'm like, yeah, they want to learn it, but are you willing to, again, help them do so?
Mm-hmm.
So we were going over um the differences between a shirt, like a blouse, and a t-shirt, right? So we get
Yeah.
to t-shirt, and they're repeating after me. They're like, t-shirt, t-shirt. And one of them points at me and goes, you're a t-shirt. And I'm like, I am not a t-shirt.
Oh,
What are they trying to
yeah.
say?
Teacher.
Teacher.
Oh,
Homophones. Yeah.
So
We
that
have
is
so
how,
many.
yes. So that is how I'm trying to do this really wherever I go.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really, this might sound very cliche or simple, or it's really about kindness, right? It's about
Mm-hmm.
being a better person and reaching out to help somebody, even though maybe you don't agree with, or you don't understand why they're here. And I think if people really understood what immigrants go through to come here. And I work all over the place. I mean, some have visas, some don't. My ESL students are all here on TN visas, I've learned a lot about that program. Their end goal is not to stay here in the US. Their end goal is to go back to Mexico, and they all have kids in Mexico.
yeah.
I mean, can you imagine? I learned from one of the employees that I worked with yesterday. She has a 9 and an 11-year-old in Guatemala that she hasn't seen for a year and a half.
Oh my
Yeah, I
gosh.
can't imagine.
Yeah.
Wow. So, you said we had an article in Lancaster Farming talking about you and your program, and in the article you said a quote that you also already said on this podcast that really stuck out to me, which is there's a difference between ignorance and arrogance. So, could you just kind of go into a little more about what you mean by that, and also how can people, a, not be arrogant, but also like kind of take steps to like working through their own ignorances?
Mhm. First step is realizing that you have either of them, right? So I tell people, I love to give examples because sometimes that helps us see these things better. I was very ignorant about the poultry and swine industries. I know dairy like the back of my hand, but when I was approached to write curriculum for poultry and swine, I'm like, I have no idea what I eat both of the animals, but I don't, I don't know much about the production side. So case in point, I went to a huge hatchery here in Pennsylvania, and being ignorant and willing to change that requires being vulnerable. So I had
Yeah.
to be vulnerable and say, look, I don't understand what you do. Can you teach me? Can you show me? And that was anywhere from talking to management at this hatchery. And then I asked if I could sit down with some Spanish speakers, and found out that this company, the two most popular countries that their workers were from were Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. So I asked to sit down with each of them in the same room. And I was there for like 2.5 hours, and they were like, I had what I know, like common words for, things like chicken and hatchery, like all of those production terms. And they were giving me terms that I had never heard before in my life. Right. Case in point, there is a setter, I think. I'd have to look at my notes. There's no English word for it. So it was a really fun conversation to ask, okay, well, if there's a new person coming, say they're from Dominican Republic, how do you explain what these things are? And so for one word that we have in English, I actually have like a 5-word explanation to help, get somebody to understand that. But so that, again, being vulnerable, saying, you know what, I do speak Spanish, but I am always learning. That is one thing too, I will tell you. When I meet a new Spanish speaker, I introduce myself and I actually tell them, look, my Spanish isn't perfect. I twitch a little bit when people are like, oh, so you're fluent? And I'm like, ugh. I will never be 100. Like, I am always learning. So that's actually a phrase that I teach my very first day of class to my students, so they can use that with Spanish speakers, because it's so funny. I encourage them we go over greetings first, right? So I'm like, listen, I know it's been first day of class, but if you're on a farm tomorrow or this week, I want you to use one of these. And some students do. And they come back and they're like, Katie, I walked in the milking parlor and I said, buenos dias. And they were like, oh my gosh, this person speaks Spanish. And then they're like, blah, 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 blah. So I was like, okay, that's why we're going to learn this phrase. Estoy aprendiendo español. I am learning Spanish. That way they're like, oh, okay. Right? Yeah. They're still learning. I add one word to that, which is siempre, which means always. I am always learning. So again, when I'm sitting down with management of, again, sectors that I'm not familiar with in agriculture, I'm telling you, you know what? I'm a blank slate. Help me out with this. The arrogance part is, you also have to be cognizant of that. Ask yourself, what do you currently think? It's really, if you want to take it down to brass tacks, it's you thinking that you're better than anyone else for anything. Your culture, your language, your way of life, the way you look. It could be anything. Arrogance is a little harder because, one, you have to be cognizant of the fact that you are arrogant about something. And I've called people out on it. I'm like, oh, are we arrogant much? You know, because like,
I'm sure they love hearing that.
You know, I can be blunt, and I'm learning how to rein it in a little bit.
I think sometimes you need that bluntness, though.
I do. I agree. Because sometimes I just want people to think, why do you think that? Why do you think your language is better? Why do you think that? And unfortunately, a lot of it is some people just haven't had exposure to other cultures before. I travel a lot, especially since I don't have a dairy anymore. And I actually get a lot of flack about it a lot from people. I also have a lot of people that are very supportive and think it's cool and whatnot. I don't do it for the cool factor. I do it because I want to learn more. And when I have a goal to go to a different Latin American country every year, and that is to learn more dialects, it's to improve my Spanish, it's to meet people. I love meeting new people, fostering these new relationships. And I can bring these experiences back and, not only to my classroom, but just to my everyday conversations. And travel is a huge teacher. I say it's probably my biggest teacher. And so when you get outside of your bubble, and you know what, you don't even have to leave the United States. If you don't want to leave the US, you don't have to, because we have subcultures, right? The culture in the South is completely different than the culture in the North or the West or wherever. But there are always commonalities, right? I kind of go back to advocating for agriculture. Find the commonality that you have as a farmer with your non-farming public. It's usually family. It's usually food, things like that. So the arrogance piece can be a little harder, but the first step is recognizing that you are arrogant, and you know what? I need to change that. And that it comes with time, and really you have to, I'm just going to go back to that quote of changing your mindset or your attitude when presented with new information.
Yeah. I think that a lot of people, and I'm not, probably myself included, need to take that under advisement, I think, especially in this like kind of divisive period that we're living in. There just seems to be a lot of people that are just so unwilling to listen, to take in, to process, and then to reassess.
Yes.
And I think that is one of the problems that we're dealing with today.
I'll give you a non-language example. When I first started traveling, I connected with this girl who actually runs a travel group, and she asked me what I did for a living, and I told her, because I was needing to make sure that I could still work. People think that these are vacations. They're not. I always take my laptop. I'm always working. And she's like, oh yeah, you should be fine. What do you do? And I explained like everything I do in agriculture, right? Then she goes, so I'm a vegan. And the old Katie, who used to get death threats on social media from vegans when I was advocating for agriculture, the old Katie would have been like, you know what? Never mind. I can't deal with you. I can't communicate with you. But there was something in me that I was like, you know what? If I'm going to preach about getting to know other people and putting your biases aside, then don't just talk the talk, but walk the walk. And it's funny, her name is also Katie. And so we traveled together. We had it out one day. We were in Morocco, actually. And we had it out about agriculture versus, her vegan ideas and whatnot. And anyway, long story short, we are really good friends to this day because we have agreed to disagree. She listens to me about agriculture. I listen to her about her concerns about agriculture and why she's vegan. I am never going to be vegan. I don't know that she'll ever be not vegan. That's not my goal here. Yeah. I've been able to foster this relationship with her because I focus on the other things that we have in common. We have a lot in common. We both speak Spanish. We both have taught ESL. We both love to travel. We have similar names, stuff like that. And I'm actually really proud of myself for doing that because, again, Katie, like 5-10 years ago, would have never done that.
Yeah.
And I just feel like I try really hard to keep an open mind about things. And she had some points about agriculture, but again, we're able to have really good constructive conversations about that topic.
Yeah.
Because I was arrogant about it, right? I thought, well, nope, farming's great. And and farming is still great. I'm not saying that it's not, but I had to, that was me trying to work on my own arrogance.
What does being a woman in ag mean to you?
It means there's really no difference of what I can do and what I can provide to others in agriculture to help.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Katie, for joining us here in the farmhouse. We loved talking to you.
And I guess I speak literally no Spanish. I really wish I did speak Spanish, but I guess we should have said gracias, not thank you.
Yes, yeah.
Well, de nada, muchas gracias. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. And just FYI, you're never too old to learn a language. My oldest student, who is still taking private tutoring lessons with me, just turned 75.
Nice.
Yeah.
I do think I've said it before that I think it would be very cool to learn Spanish. And I will say my dad, who is in his 70s, actually has said that he thinks it'd be cool to learn Spanish. So maybe I'll drag him and we'll just learn it together.
Oh my gosh, then you would have people to, practice with. It's a lot of fun. It really is. I wish people wouldn't. I'm trying to change the intimidation factor because it's actually easier than English.
Yeah, no, I believe it. English is hard.
English is hard.
All right.
Well, thank you. It was so great having you with us,
Yeah, we
Katie.
can say adios.
Yes, adios.
That was such a great conversation with Katie. I enjoyed that a lot.
Yeah, I think it was very different from pretty much every other conversation we've had. And we have a lot of unique conversations. But, there are certain topics and themes that tend to come up frequently on here. And I feel like this one was one that was just, we didn't hit on a lot of our usual beats. And it was refreshing and nice to hear Katie's perspective.
And it's definitely something that, 70%, I definitely did not know that 70% of ag workers in the US speak Spanish. And as I mentioned to Katie, I would love to learn Spanish. I mostly studied German all throughout high school and college. I took 1 year of Spanish in 7th grade, and I just remember so little from it. I can do like numbers and colors, and for some reason, weather terminology stuck with me. So when it's very cold out, I can say hace mucho frío, which just means it's very cold. And I don't know why that's what's like up there. Those are the random things that stuck. But I'm like, at the end of the day, I work in the ag industry, and it would be nice to be able to speak Spanish. What if I need to interview a farm worker who speaks Spanish? It'd be nice to be able to.
It would be,
to communicate a little more. But so what about you? I know you're not quite a Spanish speaker either.
No. It's funny that you have like 1 year of Spanish and the rest German, because I'm the inverse, where I took probably 5 years of Spanish because I started in 8th grade all the way through 12th. And then I got to college, I had to take a year of a language, and I said, oh, let's try German. And similarly, I kind of remember like counting, and I can say like, the wetter ist gut, which sounds so much like the English version of saying the weather is good. And I like remember Obst for fruit. But yeah, not a lot stuck. And I do remember Spanish seemed so much easier in comparison. But so I'm half Puerto Rican. And so my relationship to the Spanish language is at times complicated and guilt-ridden, because I am one of the few people on that side of the family that is not a speaker. My sister and I are kind of the only ones who were not brought up speaking Spanish. It is something that I guess I regret not learning or putting more effort toward. I will say one thing that Katie mentioned that I really appreciated hearing was the fact that she takes into account that there are different dialects, because one thing I remember hearing from multiple Spanish teachers coming up through middle school and high school was the fact that they kind of looked down on the Puerto Rican dialogue. Several of them use the phrase, oh, well, they butcher the Spanish language, which at the time, it kind of rang funny in my ears, but I didn't really think too much about it. But looking back now, I think that is an example of the arrogance that Katie was speaking about. And it's kind of a funny sort of arrogance, because none of those teachers were native speakers. They were all people who were brought up in English-speaking households, and they learned Spanish, and they decided to teach Spanish to others, which is a great thing. I just think that maybe they should not have been saying that sort of thing about a dialogue of a language that, well, they should be saying it at all about any dialogue of any language, but especially one that is not their native language.
Well, it's interesting too, because I think, at least within the high school level, most of the Spanish that you're learning is stemming from Spain specifically. While
Peninsular Spanish.
Yeah. While most of the people who are actively speaking Spanish in this country are stemming from Latin America or Mexico. Like my friend Brittany, her dad is from Mexico. He grew up in Mexico, and she did not grow up speaking Spanish, but she took it in high school. And I know, like her dad would kind of joke with her about like, well, that's not the real words. Like we use these words, because it's very different. And so it's interesting that we're, at least in the US, we're teaching a version of the language that is not really necessarily what's commonly used in the area.
Yeah.
So I think it's cool that, Katie, she's going to Latin America, she's going to Mexico, she's asking people specifically like, okay, well, in your dialect, what words do you prefer? Like,
she's putting in the work, and you have to respect it. So I think that wraps it up for us. Thank you all for listening. If you liked this episode, please consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. And if you really liked this episode, please consider leaving us a review.
If you have any questions or thoughts about this episode or the podcast, please send us an email at farmhouse@lancasterfarming.com.
You can also find us on social media at Lancaster Farming on most platforms.
Thank you all so much for joining us at the Farmhouse. I'm Stephanie.
I'm Candace.
And we'll talk to you later.
Bye.
This episode of The Farmhouse is copyright 2024 by Lancaster Farming Newspaper, part of the Steinman Communications family.
It was written by Stephanie Spiker and Candace Wierzbowski. It was produced by Eric Herlock and Matt Lee. The music you've heard throughout the show is courtesy of Tin Bird Shadow.